Hi, today we are going to discuss another question which was asked in the Tamil Nadu Dr. MGR Medical University first MBBS Biochemistry subject examinations. So here comes the scenario. A village health nurse instructs a mother to provide her child a drink made with 6 teaspoons of sugar and half teaspoon of salt dissolved in 1 liter of clean water to rehydrate the child. So from this scenario, you'll be able to understand that the child has been in some dehydration and we are supposed to rehydrate the child. For that, the nurse has instructed to mix sugar and salt in a particular proportion in 1 liter of clean water. So this is the scenario given and the questions are as follows. So the questions were like this. Why is sugar included in oral rehydration solution? What are the differences between passive diffusion and active transport? And the last question was, what is facilitated passive diffusion, and give examples. So these three questions were asked as a part of 5 mark or short note questions. So as usual, before solving a case scenario based question, let us move to the basic concepts which are required to solve the question. So here comes the basic concepts needed to solve this particular question. So for that, you need to know the basic transport mechanisms within the cell. And these transport mechanisms you have studied since the school days. So as described during your school days, two types of transport, passive transport and active transport. The word itself is self-explanatory. Passive transport. So it is passive, does not require any energy. Whereas active, so it is active, so it requires energy. That is a major difference. And passive transport, it occurs along the concentration gradient. Active transport occurs against the concentration gradient. And we have three types under passive transport: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and ion channels. In active transport, you have two types: primary active and secondary active. So this is a table taken from the textbook of biochemistry DM Vasudevan, which gives the major differences between these types of transport mechanisms, which is mandatory to know to solve these questions. Okay, so simple diffusion, it is a passive transport, so energy required is nil, and it is not against the concentration gradient, and it does not have a carrier. So it is just the flow of substances or molecules from area of higher concentration to lower concentration without any energy. Whereas facilitated diffusion, this again is a passive transport, so no energy is required. It is again a passive transport, so no, not against the concentration gradient. But one difference, it requires a carrier protein. You remember we saw a video on GLUT where GLUT or glucose transporters are a type of facilitated diffusion. You have a carrier protein which is going to carry the molecule as a part of passive transport. And then the third part of passive transport is ion channels. Ion channels is also no energy is required and no concentration gradient. It is not going to happen against the concentration gradient, but yes, it requires a carrier protein, but it allows only certain ions to pass through. For example, if it is a sodium channel, it will allow only sodium ions to pass through. So that is about ion channels. And then active transport, you have two types: primary active and secondary active. The only difference between these two is energy is required for both, but it is directly required in primary active, it is indirectly required in secondary active. So primary active, you have the example of a sodium potassium ATPase pumper, which is an example of primary active transport. And secondary active, we have seen in the video of glucose transporters, SGLT, sodium dependent glucose co-transport, which is an example of secondary active transport. So now coming to our question, which is asked in the university, why glucose is added in oral rehydration solution? So oral rehydration solution, you would have seen these packets, and most of us would have taken this as a part of treatment for whenever we have been in dehydration or some form of acute diarrheal diseases. We take this ORS, oral rehydration salts, and we mix it in water and we take it. So this has a particular composition as prescribed by the WHO. So in the composition, you have dextrose along with sodium. So dextrose, what is the purpose of dextrose? Co-transport of glucose into the epithelial cells via the sodium-dependent glucose co-transporter SGLT1 requires sodium. So, two sodium ions and one molecule of glucose are transported together across the cell membrane via SGLT1, and this is a type of symport, that is both the molecules move in the same direction. Glucose and sodium are co-transported. It is a symport. So, without glucose, intestinal sodium will not be reabsorbed or absorbed. So, in order to absorb sodium and in order to avoid the electrolyte depletion, we have to add glucose to the ORS solution. So that is the basis of adding glucose in ORS solution. So now finally, when coming back to the question, the same question where you had sugar and salt dissolved in 1 liter of clean water. Sugar is glucose and salt will have sodium chloride. We are going to rehydrate the child. The questions were, why is sugar included in oral rehydration solution? Because one of the transport mechanisms is SGLT1, where glucose and sodium are co-transported. So more of sodium is made available, and this will prevent electrolyte depletion. And differences between passive diffusion and active transport, we know it very well. Passive does not require energy. Active requires energy. Passive occurs along the concentration gradient. Active occurs against the concentration gradient. There are three types in passive transport. You have the simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and ion channels. And active transport, you have two types, primary active and secondary active. And the last question was, what is facilitated passive diffusion? And give examples. Facilitated passive diffusion, it is a passive transport in which you need a carrier protein to transport the substance. The best example is our GLUT or the glucose transporters.